Good evening, everyone. My name is Trevor McKay, and I'm the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program at Yale. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event, featuring author, commentator, and radio host Ben Shapiro for a conversation on how October 7th broke America's college campuses. First, I want to extend my thanks to Carol Brown, who is with us in the audience tonight, and the Young America's Foundation's Irving Brown Lecture Series for making this event possible. Thank you, Carol. Now, before I introduce Mr. Shapiro, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley Program. The William F. Buckley Jr. Program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a Buckley Fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. Before we begin tonight's program, I want to emphasize the Buckley Program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on freedom of expression as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of free speech. Now, I'd like to solemnly reflect on the significance of today's date. 1 year ago today, Hamas terrorists infiltrated Israeli towns and villages, murdering 1,200 innocent men, women, and children, and committing horrible atrocities. This unconscionable act was the single deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. More than 240 people of over a dozen nationalities, including many Americans, were taken hostage, around 100 of whom are still in captivity today as we speak. And the war triggered by that attack also continues to this day. We pray for an end to the war and the terrorism that initiated it, and for the safe return of the remaining hostages to their families. It is my hope that this night advances conversation, insight, and understanding to help us all think with clarity and urgency about these ongoing crises. And now, our guest for tonight. Ben Shapiro is the founding editor-in-chief and editor emeritus of The Daily Wire and the host of The Ben Shapiro Show, the largest and fastest-growing conservative podcast show in the nation. In addition, he also hosts Debunked, Ben Shapiro's book club, The Search, and The Sunday Special. Mr. Shapiro is a New York Times bestselling author of over a dozen books, focusing on higher education, free speech, and Israel. He is a much sought-after voice on college campuses and across the country for his incisive commentary on the state of our democracy and our nation. He has been a strong supporter of Israel throughout his life and has been particularly vocal in support of Israel's right to defend itself since the October 7th terror attacks 1 year ago tonight. Mr. Shapiro was hired by Creators Syndicate at age 17 to become the youngest nationally syndicated columnist in the United States. He earned a BA in political science from UCLA in 2004. And even though he graduated from Harvard Law School in 2007, we're still incredibly grateful to have him here at Yale tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ben Shapiro to Yale. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure. Ben, thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, and condolences on Michael Knowles being a graduate of your fine university.
So it's the first anniversary of the horrible terrorist attacks on Israel, and I know that many are spending today mourning, but others, even in the United States, even maybe on Yale's campus, are celebrating today's date. And I'd like to ask you, why did you want to speak on a college campus on this date and at Yale in particular?
Well, I think that October 7th revealed a lot of truths about the world that the West had been hesitant to address, but I think one of the biggest truths was revealed in the days after October 7th, when even before Israel's retaliation began, before Israel's operations to cleanse out Hamas began, there were widespread protests across the West, particularly on college campuses, in favor of Hamas. in favor of Hezbollah, in favor of those who would extirpate Israel from the planet. And that revealed to me a cancer that's at the heart of American education. I've been writing about this for a very long time, but the extent of the rot at the core of American education, I think, has been truly revealed over the course of the last year. That's why I think it's important to come and speak about that tonight, because the day is not just a day of mourning, it's a reminder of what happens when the West goes to sleep on its own principles, when it imports people who don't believe in the West principles, and when it cultivates an entire generation of people who don't believe in the mission of its civilization.
And you mentioned that protests started against Israel even before Israel responded to October 7th. And there were comparatively few responses that I saw against Hamas. And in fact, today, there was a Yale student group who encouraged us to not attend class in order to, quote, stand in solidarity to mourn the martyrs of Palestine. And so I'm wondering, can you speak to the mentality behind those who want to blame Israel for October 7th? And what do you think about the sort of religious language that this has been couched in on college campuses?
Well, I think that there are a few different groups that are complicit in this particular message. Group number one would be radical fundamentalist Muslims who believe that Israel ought to be wiped off the map. That's certainly not all Muslims. I know a great many Muslims don't believe that. Many of them are from Abraham Accords countries, for example. There are some Palestinians who don't believe that, although their voices have been in abeyance since October 7th, unfortunately. That would be group number one. Then there is a secondary group, and that group are American leftist college students who, unfortunately, have been inculcated in a belief that success is inherently connected with exploitation, and that anybody who claims to be a victim and is unsuccessful and lives in a way that seems impoverished or violent, that it must be that they've been pushed into that by the great exploiter. The victim-victimizer narrative is the ugliest narrative in politics. It goes all the way back to Cain and Abel. Nothing is new under the sun, and it's been repeated here. So the basic idea here is that because Israel is disproportionately powerful, because Israel is disproportionately successful, because Israel has actually built itself into a thriving democratic country, because of that, then anyone in the region who is suffering, that must be a byproduct. It's zero-sum thinking, and it isn't true at all. But that sort of thinking also leads to bizarre coalitions like you see on college campuses, where you see people walking around with signs that say, for example, Queers for Palestine, which is one of the great mysteries of human history, since all the people who are queer in Palestine, if found out, are dead. And the question becomes why exactly that is, and the answer is what you have are people who believe they are marginalized by the system, believe that they are victimized by the system, gathering together in a coalition in order to fight the great oppressor, Israel being the bleeding point of the spear in that vision.
Here at Yale, as with many other campuses around the nation, we had an encampment, two of them actually, of pro-Palestine students occupying a common space and denying use of that common space to other students who might not agree with those views. I'm curious what you think the mindset of these students who go beyond normal rallies, beyond normal protests. Why do they feel that they need to stage this more radical action in staging an encampment?
I'm not a psychologist. I think it would take a psychologist to examine why people would want to live in their own feces at the Tentifada. But you know, the sort of general, I think, push for it is presumably that the more you dissociate from the civilization that you are the beneficiary of, the more holy you are, the more virtuous you are. And so if you occupy a space in the center of one of the most privileged places in American life, if you take up that space, if you make that space a dangerous place to be, if you bar entry to that space, somehow you've struck a blow against the great oppressor. I notice that the vast majority of people who do this are then very upset about the possibility of being actually expelled from that space, expelled from the college campus, and whine about it the minute that any sort of consequences may actually hit them. But I think that this is the same sort of feeling that drives a lot of folks, unfortunately, in modern politics, and that is a feeling of virtue signaling that makes people feel a sense of purpose that they can't find anywhere else. And that sense of purpose is to be found in actively alienating yourself from the institution that you're an active beneficiary of.
Do you think any universities dealt with October 7th particularly well?
Yeah, I think University of Florida dealt with it great. I think the University of Florida, which at the time was being run by Ben Shapiro, who's the president down there, put out a statement and said you are perfectly within your rights to protest in designated spaces, time, place, and manner restrictions, and the minute you violate those, you'll be expelled. And that was the end of it. It turns out that this is actually not particularly difficult. It also turns out that whenever we hear that viewpoint has nothing to do with it, that these universities would have let anybody do this, we all know what bullshit that is. I mean, to put the point a little bluntly. If people had been on the lawns at Yale protesting in favor of white supremacy, they would have been expelled forthwith, and we all know it.
I'd like to focus on university bureaucracies for a moment, because zoom in a little closer to what I think some of the problem might be. Diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are also often a huge part of any university's bureaucracy, even at Yale. And I was wondering, why do you think that it is that DEI seems to place such little emphasis on Jewish individuals in particular, despite the historic marginalization of Jews?
Well, because historic marginalization is completely beside the point. The entire point of the DEI mentality is, again, that victimizer narrative. And so what DEI essentially posits is that the more victimized you are, the less successful you are. Jews violate that narrative. So, by the way, do Asians, which is why they're constantly discriminated against when it comes to admissions. The basic idea is that Asians are not actual minorities who've experienced any sort of oppression in the United States because they're too successful. They get their scores on the SATs are too good, and therefore it's perfectly well within bounds for universities to openly discriminate against them, not admit them to universities. The same thing happens with Jews. The idea is that all suffering of the past or in the present by Jews is completely irrelevant because it breaks the matrix. The minute that the victimized group also happens to be disproportionately economically and educationally successful, the entire worldview breaks down. And so the only way to avoid that is to then relabel minority groups that are both victimized and successful as white, right? So Jews then suddenly become members of the white super class, and the same thing happens to Asians. Asians suddenly become white adjacent, right, is the phraseology that's frequently used, because God forbid the stupid and nefarious worldview of DEI is somehow broken by reality. That has to be maintained by relabeling people into categories that fit the worldview better.
Do you think there's a connection between DEI bureaucracies on university campuses and what we saw in the aftermath of October 7th?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the DEI bureaucracy on campus agrees with the basic worldview of those who are protesting on campus. Otherwise, they wouldn't have allowed it. Again, I go back to the simple fact that if it had been Nazis who had actually been protesting on campus as opposed to the new Nazis, then it would have been a very different story as to how the administration dealt with it.
Why do you think university students are particularly inspired by Palestine against Israel? I mean, for instance, in September 2023, Azerbaijan displaced over 100,000 Armenians, mostly Christians, and I didn't hear anybody at Yale talking about it. I didn't see the YDN writing about it. I didn't see the news talking about it. Why do you think that is?
Of course. I mean, the same thing is true in Sudan or Somalia. I mean, there's great suffering all around the world. The reason, again, that this has become the tip of the left-wing spear is because it is almost the perfect example of an event that ought to break the matrix, and so you have to grip it that much harder. There's this idea in sociology, which is usually a bullshit field, but has a couple of good points. Sorry, sociology majors, but you're going to have to find employment elsewhere. There is the idea in sociology that basically many of the things that we do in life are signaling that we have skin in the game. Right? So for example, I wear a yarmulke. It symbolizes that I have skin in the Jewish game. Right? It means that I go to synagogue regularly. We all have these sorts of things. We dress in a certain way to demonstrate that we have skin in the game. Well, if you want to demonstrate that you have skin in the game of the victim-victimizer narrative, what you do is you pick literally the worst example of supposed victims on the planet, and then you declare that they are the victims. So you take Hamas, which is literally the worst people you could declare victims. I mean, they are fascists. They are the actual new Nazis. They are genocidal maniacs. They habitually engage in the murder of their political opponents. They engaged in mass rape. They celebrated the murder of children. You can hear that they triumphantly live-streamed all of this. And they did all of this while siphoning billions of dollars away from the Palestinian people to build hundreds of kilometers of terror tunnels to hide below the civilians, so when Israel had to go in, civilians would have to die in order for Israel to be able to clear the territory. These are not victims. These are just evil, like the worst people in modern life. And somehow, the best way to demonstrate that you have skin in the game is to declare that they are actually the victims. If you can maintain that philosophy, man, do you have skin in the game. Man, have you demonstrated your fealty to this perverse worldview if you can actually agree that somehow Hamas are the victims in this situation.
If, God forbid, 9/11 were to happen tomorrow in the United States, how do you think the people that are in favor of Hamas here on this campus would react?
I think they would react very much the same way. I mean, I think that, for example, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement would similarly like to boycott, divest, and sanction the United States, except they haven't yet found a way to live here 5 feet off the ground, floating in the air. You know, the reality is that when they take the position that Hamas is somehow the good guy, these are the same people who would declare that Osama bin Laden was probably justified in 9/11. After all, there's a long history of American involvement in the Middle East, and isn't he just an impoverished? No, he wasn't. Isn't he just an well, no, he wasn't. Isn't he just, a good-hearted person who wishes the best for his children? No, he isn't. But you get the point. The idea, again, is that anybody who is attacking the West is doing so for good reason, because in the end, the West is bad. And this is, I think, one of the big lessons of October 7th as well. Despite the West's desperate attempt to go back to sleep, the reality is that Israel was attacked because it is perceived as a Western country. That is why it was attacked. It was specifically picked and chosen because it is an element of the West. Okay, it is not that radical Muslims, that members of Hamas, that the radical left, that they hate America because they hate Israel. It's they hate Israel because they hate America. Because Israel, they say it themselves, they say it's a quote-unquote colonialist outpost of the West. I mean, they're not hiding the ball here. And so if they hate the quote-unquote colonialist outpost of the West, what do you think they think of the West directly?
A phenomenon that came to Yale in a significant way after the attack was media bias and censorship of what Hamas actually did on the ground in Israel. Weeks after it was well reported in major news outlets across the country, our campus paper removed references to rape that occurred during the attacks. Could you talk a little bit about the media reaction to October 7th and what you've seen so far, how it's changed over the course of the year? I
mean, the media are generally trash, which is why I started my own media outlet. But you know, the legacy media, particularly when it comes to the Middle East, are true garbage. I think it was Michael Crichton who suggested famously that if you ever want to know how bad the newspapers are, read a newspaper on a topic that you know really, really well. Right? Because what you will see is that the articles are filled with errors. The journalists and reporters don't actually know what they're talking about on the topic that you know really well. So if you're a math major and you see them writing about math, you'll read the article and realize there are 10 errors in this one article. And then you'll flip over to the foreign policy pages and you'll be like, well, they probably know what they're talking about here. And that's not true. So much of the coverage has been wildly skewed, incredibly biased. The headlines are all determined to try and achieve some sort of moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, largely by labeling things like the Israel-Gaza war, as though Israel is at war with a place as opposed to with an actual terror group that launched a terror assault on them. While Israel, by the way, has been providing literally hundreds of thousands of tons of human supplies, nutritional supplies, into Gaza in the middle of a war that it is fighting, sacrificing its own soldiers in order to do that. Israel is engaging in the most targeted urban military operation literally in human history right now. And somehow the media come up with the idea that this is a borderline genocidal action by Israel. They're doing the same thing in Lebanon, where Israel is, again, delivering some of the most targeted strikes in the history of warfare. And they did it after the Israeli Beeper operation, which is literally the most targeted strike in the history of warfare. So, you know, the media coverage is truly egregious, and it all comes from a morally relativistic place that has to maintain the idea that at least if Israel isn't the victimizer, well, they're kind of still the victimizer, even in the aftermath of October 7th. So you got about a week of sympathetic media coverage and then immediately shifted back into the cycle of violence. If only we could come to a deal, if only we could craft some sort of negotiation where everyone would go home happy, as opposed to the reality, which is there are fundamentally incompatible goals in the Middle East. Israel has this really troubling need to breathe and survive, and its enemies have apparently a wildly justifiable need to destroy it and kill every Jew in the region.
In that case, do you think there's any hope for truth? If these people were confronted with bare fact that showed the horrors of what Hamas did on October 7th, would that change their mind, or would they just continue on the same path?
I mean, I think that you have to take everybody on a one-by-one basis. Some folks are obviously open to the truth, and a lot of people aren't. As far as fighting the dominance of the legacy media, again, that's why we started a very, very large conservative media company specifically to fight the narrative that's been driven by the legacy media.
A lot of people, I think, look at this conflict and they really just have no idea what's going on. They don't know what to think. They don't know who to believe. What do you think is most purely at stake in this conflict going on right now? I mean,
what's purely at stake is the very definition of evil. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is that Hamas is a terrorist group that states its goals openly and outright, forthrightly. They're not hiding anything. I mean, they say that they wish to destroy the state of Israel. They invaded Israel from a territory that had effectively been ceded to them in 2005 when Israel unilaterally withdrew from the territory, so this was not a border dispute. They did not attack purely military targets. They specifically went into towns, including, by the way, civilians from Gaza who went into those towns in order to participate in the mass rape and murder and kidnapping. What's at stake is whether the West even has the capacity to label evil evil at this point, which is really, I think, a serious ongoing question. I don't think that question is limited, obviously, to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And again, I even hesitate to label it the Israel-Palestinian conflict because I don't think that every Palestinian is a supporter of Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, Islamic Jihad, or Hamas, although a disproportionate share, unfortunately, are. The the question is going to be, going forward, whether the West has the strength to recognize when there are actual threats to it, or whether it wishes to simply pretend that everyone in the world has the same basic goals, wants to live the same kind of life, and it's just a matter of pragmatic differences over how we reach that. Very, very few lies have been told that are greater than that one.
What do you think the best way for people that may not have a connection to Israel, what do you think the best way for them to kind of memorialize what happened 1 year ago today would be?
Well, I mean, listen, I think that everybody in the West has a stake in paying attention to the victims. There's still ongoing hostage. I was with the family of a 20-year-old who's being held hostage. Literally today, I was with his mom and his dad and his younger brother today, actually with President Trump over in Queens. I had on my show just last week a different set of parents who have a son who's been held hostage. I've met multiple families who have kids who've been held. Those people are still being held hostage. And understand that, unfortunately, when it comes to the fight against Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran, which is really their sponsor state, the only way out is through. War is ugly. No one wants it, particularly, by the way, not the Israelis. Particularly not the Israelis, who have been in a state of constant war since 1947. Literally every Israeli at the age of 18 is drafted, and that's going to include the religious soon enough. I mean, if you are everyone your age, everyone in this audience your age is in the Israeli military. Everyone. Okay, if you think that their parents want them to be serving on the front lines in southern Lebanon, you don't. By the way, and it's not, I don't just mean people right now who are 20, 21. I'm talking about anybody in this crowd who's 40, 45. I know parents with 3, 4 kids who are currently on the front lines in southern Lebanon called up. If you think that's what the Israelis want, you're out of your mind. That is certainly not what the Israelis want. The only way, however, that you come to an actual peace, and this is just the lesson of historic war, the way that you come to peace is not through empty-headed diplomacy where people say funny words and then they sign a piece of paper and then they violate their word 5 seconds later. Victory is the only way that you actually achieve peace. That is the historic lesson of war. It is victory and the threat of a crushing victory that dissuades people from engaging in these sorts of attacks. And that's not even me, making that case. There's a historian who wrote a book called The Causes of War, where he examined literally every war from the year 1700 to 1988. And what he found was, again, the only way that you actually achieve lasting peace in a time of war is for one side to actively defeat the other, which is something the West is very not used to. The West has decided that victory is a dirty word.
Do you think that the United States has been doing enough to ensure the return of the hostages and the creation of lasting peace?
Hell no. No, I think the United States has acted under the Biden-Harris administration. I mean, everyone knows my politics, I would assume, at this point. The Biden-Harris administration, which started off, I will say, at the very beginning of the war fairly well, immediately then launched into a soft, morally relativistic stance in which the idea was that if aid was slow-walked to Israel, somehow this would facilitate peace negotiations as opposed to incentivizing Hamas to keep going. Hamas understands that they are militarily inferior. I mean, right now, basically no one in the upper echelon of Hamas is left alive. Yahya Sinwar may be alive in a bunker somewhere surrounded by live hostages. But it's not as though he has any sort of serious military force at his disposal. What he's counting on is that the United States will force Israel into making some sort of concessions that will allow him and his group to survive. The United States could have done something very easy. They could have done this, by the way, in Ukraine as well. They could have said, listen, our allies deserve our support in a time of war. They should be able to pursue the ends that are necessary in order for them to achieve victory. The United States should not be in the position of micromanaging the wars of our allies. It's a stupid idea in the first place. And it's particularly stupid when America's enemies are watching and they see every act of weakness as another sign that the United States is not willing to stand up for its allies in the region. And the reality is October 7th never would have happened if the Biden administration had not immediately come into office and started playing footsie with the Islamic Republic of Iran. If that had never happened, then October 7th never would have happened in the first place. The Saudis and the Israelis likely would have already signed the Abraham Accords. You would have seen the continuation of the budding peace in the Middle East. That was, until very recently, the actual wave of the future over there, and I think will be again now that Israel has reestablished its military deterrence in the region.
And one last question before I hand it over to the audience for their Q&A. William F. Buckley Jr. wrote God and Man at Yale nearly 75 years ago. In it, he criticizes Yale for promoting secularism and collectivism while undermining traditional values. He argues Yale's intellectual environment is hostile to the principles upon which our institution was founded. Do you think his critique is relevant to what happened at our universities after October 7th? Does it still hold true today?
Yeah, just a little.
Yeah.
Just a little.
Is there hope? Is there hope for our institutions?
I think there is hope for your institutions, but your donors are going to have to start threatening to withdraw their money. That's the actual answer. And employers are going to have to start looking at degrees from Yale and determining whether they are in fact worth the paper that they're written on. And by the way, I'm not singling out Yale here. The same thing is true of my alma mater, Harvard, which is having very similar experiences. It's true for most of the major, it's okay, you can hiss them, I don't like them either. It's true of most of the major universities in the country at this point. Employers are making a grave mistake if they believe that just because you have a poli-sci degree from a top university, that makes you qualified to hold a job. In many cases, it makes you the reverse of that.
Well, thank you very much for our conversation.
Q&A. Excuse me. We are now moving into the Q&A portion of the evening. If you have a question for Mr. Shapiro, please come forward, come to the back of the auditorium, circle your way around, and stand behind this yellow line right here, and we'll be able to get your question.
It doesn't have to be on this topic. Obviously, it can be on anything. And also, I do have a general rule, which is if you disagree, you can raise your hand and go to the front. But you actually have to disagree. Don't do it just to get to the front.
Mr. Shapiro, thank you for sharing your thoughts tonight. America, our country, fought a protracted global war on terror for 2 decades. Just as you have mentioned today, we have faced the ethical problems of war, political problems, opposition, support for it. But one day seemed to lay sacred in our country, the Day of Remembrance on 9/11. And even whether you were for or against the war, that day seemed to be a day where we remembered thousands of civilians, firefighters, and police lost their lives. Given that today is October 7th, what do you think the ethical consequences are of you politicizing today as a day of anti-war protest and not a day of remembrance for the people who lost their lives this fateful day?
So frankly, I think that we celebrate 9/11 wrong. I think that the idea that 9/11 ought to just be a sad day in which you remember that some people died in a tower somewhere, as a congresswoman from Minnesota might say, I think that is a grave error. It should be a reminder of the enemies that the United States faced on 9/11, continues to face today. We seem to have forgotten about all of those lessons, which is why I think that we're doomed to repeat similar instances. I don't tend to believe that acts of terror are equivalent to deaths by natural tragedy. I think that it's one thing to hold a commemoration for a natural tragedy, something horrible happens in life, and we all mourn that horrible thing happening. I think that when you're talking about an act of war, which is what 9/11 was, or if you're talking about Pearl Harbor, or if you're talking about October 7th, the idea that you can treat that in the same way that you would, say, a day of remembrance for people who died from a flu pandemic, I think that is wrong-headed and foolish, because if you can't take away the lesson from October 7th or 9/11 or any other day in remembrance of the victims of terrorism, that terrorism is evil, that it ought to be fought, that those who believe in the ideology that forward it need to be defeated, then I think you're doing the memorial wrong.
Hi, Ben. My name is Zach. It's nice to meet you. So as we stand here, talk today, students are holding a vigil to commemorate the people who died on October 7th. And this event is counter-programming that vigil. In fact, multiple student organizations wrote you letters asking you to hold this event at a different time. Porque a Vote tells us that you can serve God or you can serve yourself. You are being paid thousands of dollars to counter-program a vigil for the victims of October 7th. So my question to you is, how are you not serving yourself with this event?
Well, since there are hundreds of people who showed up to hear me talk about what's going on, I don't think that it's serving myself per se. I also don't think that I need the money. So my suggestion would be that there are many ways to commemorate what happened. I don't think that the folks who wish to hold different events have a veto on my event. I certainly don't have a veto on theirs. In fact, there was one event that contacted me that was programmed at the same time, and I attempted to actually move our event so that it did not conflict with that event. They ended up moving their event earlier and actually went to that memorial event at the Chabad at 5 o'clock. So this notion that I'm somehow ignoring the wishes of the entire Jewish community or large swaths of the Jewish community by coming and speaking about the most vital issue on the most vital day of the last year is insipid. And your insulting attempts to quote Pirkei Avot at me are frankly uninspired. That's fine. It's fine. Yes, fine. Sure.
So just to provide some additional context, I think it was Slivka, the Hillel on campus sent you a letter. I believe Chabad might have sent a letter too. YFI sent you a letter.
Well, I
we
mean,
have all these groups of Jewish students.
So weird that I coordinated with Chabad. As far as Hillel, there are many organizations on campus. I don't agree with all of them politically. They don't all agree with me politically. But I do not give anyone a veto power on my ability to speak on, again, a very important day about a very important topic of conversation.
Rescheduling an event for a different hour, not the 7 p.m. visual, which has been planned for 5 months.
I didn't realize I was the administrator who set this event at a 400-seat theater when I could easily fill a 3,000-seat one.
So you're saying right now that you never considered moving an event just 1 hour to allow the vigil that had been planned for 5 months.
What I'm saying is I don't book the halls here. I don't book the halls here. Why don't you direct your questions at the Yale administration if you're so perturbed about this?
No, this is a question out of legitimate concern.
No, I've answered your question. I appreciate the time.
Oh, you can hold it. Well, I'm glad I got to follow that guy. So, Ben, my name's Don Rapini from here in Connecticut. So, listen, I want to thank you and the Daily Wire for everything you do. I'm a subscriber, a longtime listener. And what I appreciate most is the way you fight for our freedoms, whether it's mandates or it's the freedom of speech. And, you know, today something happened to me that was very disturbing. It reminds me that there's another front where we have to fight for our conservative voice. I was on ChatGPT trying to do a simple graphic. It says, never forget. And I wanted to put a Star of David on there. And I asked for a Jewish theme. And I asked ChatGPT for an Israeli theme. And it rejected me in every corner. And it reminds me that this is just another way where we have to fight for our voices. And I want to know if you have any plans to help fight on the AI front.
Well, I mean, the good news is that Grock exists, right? So Grock has no limits. You can do whatever you want there, as crazy as you want it to be. Right? Everyone knows that I'm friendly with Elon. You know, I think that Grock will generate whatever image you want, and it'll do so very quickly, and the images that it makes are actually quite amazing. So I'm a big believer in AI, actually. I think that AI has tremendous potential to change the world. And I also am very pleased that there are a lot of competitors who are capable of outcompeting ChatGPT if they decide to place arbitrary limits on the kind of images that can be created.
Thank you for
Thanks so much.
Hi, thanks for being here. I wanted to ask, so you mentioned that like employers and donors could do a lot to affect change on a college campus, but since you're looking at an audience of students, I'm sure there's a lot of like interesting ways that you think students can affect change on a college campus, and I want to hear what you think those are and like how they could be practically implemented by a student body that wants the world to know that evil is evil.
Right, so I mean, I think there are a bunch of things that you guys can do. So the first thing that you guys can do is actually make the public aware of what's going on campus. So listen, when I was in college, I would say most kids didn't want to be involved in politics at all, right? You want to get through your degree, you want to go on with the rest of your life, and then, you know, every so often you remember where you went, you brag about it, and that's kind of it. Maybe you cut a check every so often. But the reality is that most Americans don't actually know what's going on campus, which is why it was so shocking when all of a sudden there were these giant protests that suddenly erupted on campus. You know, sounding the clarion call, getting in touch with outlets like ours, we report on this stuff fairly regularly. There are other outlets that do as well. So I think that number one, I'll say, as my mentor Andrew Breitbart once said, if you've got a phone, you got a camera, you're now a journalist. So you should be out there, you know, making things stories. The second thing that you can be doing is organizing. And yeah, that's uncomfortable. And yeah, it means that you're going to have to, you know, not be friends with everybody. I can safely say, as you might have guessed, not a friends person. Right? So when I was on the college campus, that was not my top priority, nor is it my top priority today. Well, so thank God I have my own cadre of friends. I call them my children and my wife. But the thing that you can do is you can organize, you can do events, and you can expose what's going on in the classroom. You can expose professors. You can expose what administrators are doing. You know, there is a special window that you have into the campuses that no one else does because you're on one. I know this because this is actually what I did at UCLA. I mean, again, I got started in this job, you know, working in politics when I was 17. I was at UCLA at the time. My first book was about bias on college campuses. It was called Brainwash, and it came out in 2004. Okay, so it's been 20 years. And what I did is I basically reported from what was going on inside the classroom. So you can all do that.
Thank you.
Hey Ben, thanks for being here. My name's Manny. I'm actually a fan of your show, and I'm part of YAF at BU. As a pro-lifer myself, I have an abortion question that some leftists bring up. So if you were in a burning hospital, and on one side there were 100 in vitro fertilized eggs, and on the other side there were 5 born babies, and you had to only save one side, which would you save and why?
Okay, so the traditional answer that anyone would give is you'd save the 5 born babies. And the reason that you save the 5 born babies is because the embryos have a chance at life, they're already alive, but they have a chance at living a full life outside the womb already, right? So this is the left says, well, this is an argument about viability. Now you're arguing that a life outside the womb is more valuable because of viability. Right, but these are embryos that are not in a womb right now. So if the question was, you know, you can save the baby or I can punch this 9-month pregnant woman in the stomach, it might be a slightly different question. Also, this does not define the value of life. Our sort of gut reaction as to which life is more valuable doesn't define the value of life. So let me give you another example where, you know, I could give, here's a very similar example. Burning building, 80-year-old person, 5-year-old child. Who do you save? Right, and the answer that most people are going to give is the 5-year-old child. Does that mean the 80-year-old person is not alive? Does it mean that their life is not worthless? I could also give an example, a sort of hypothetical in which you would save the embryos. So let's say that you're on a spaceship. Okay, and we're doing hypotheticals are fun. You're on a spaceship, and on this spaceship you have a 5-year-old child or 1,000 embryos. Okay, and you're the last spaceship in existence, and you are the future of humanity. Okay, and you got to save one: the 5-year-old child or the 1,000 embryos. Which one do you save? Well, now you save the 1,000 embryos because the entire future of the human species is at stake, and so you want to save the 1,000 as opposed to the 1. So our sort of gut level reaction as to which life we would save it's not a dispositive answer to whether there is value to the life that's being formed. Also, it's a weird false hypothetical because that's never the choice. Nobody is ever like, you know what, I'm 6 months pregnant, and so here's my question: do I save this child or do I murder this 5-year-old? Right? That's never been a thing that's ever arisen.
And then my other question is, if you support the death penalty, how should abortion be criminalized in terms of who and what the adequate punishment is? I've heard you say that you would say in the case of a woman getting the abortion that the woman has like a lack of mens rea, which is like lack of criminal intent. They don't meet the standards for that. But like if you hire a hitman, wouldn't you be punished for hiring that hitman to like commit an act of murder?
Well, I mean, it's sort of a questionable premise in the sense that if you hired a hitman to kill a vegetable, right, or what you thought was a vegetable, which is what most people think when they get an abortion, right? They believe that the thing that they're killing doesn't have innate human value. Very few people are willing to admit this thing has innate human value. It's a human life. I'm killing it anyway. Right? That's actually pretty horrifying if you think about it, if that's the way people are approaching abortion. But the vast majority of people who are approaching abortion that way are not thinking about it that way. It'd be like hiring a hitman to kill a cow, or in the viewpoint of the person who's in your analogy. So, you know, if let's say that you are an abortion doctor, let's say you're Kermit Gosnell, and you're an abortion doctor, and you partially abort fetuses, and then they're born alive sometimes, and you kill them, then Kermit Gosnell should have received the death penalty, right? So, you know, it depends on the level of mens rea, the level of egregious, you know, the egregiousness of the murder. But yeah, I'm certainly in favor of the death penalty in certain cases. It's not an across the board yes or no kind of thing.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Hello. You quoted or mentioned a book earlier. I didn't quite catch it when you were talking about how peace can only be achieved through victory and defeat.
Long-lasting peace, yes.
Long-lasting peace. Okay. And I was also hoping if you could give an example of a relevant example of such victory and defeat, and then talk about what victory and defeat would look like in this case with Israel and
Sure.
Gaza.
Okay. So the author is, I believe, Jeffrey Blaney. The book is The Cause of War by Jeffrey Blaney. The perfect example, obviously, is World War II. So World War I actually ends with a negotiated end, right? World War I is negotiated, and everybody's like, oh, the Versailles Treaty, it's so terrible. Look how it incentivized Germany to then have to pay reparations, and then that leads to World War II. And so look if everybody had just been nicer to Germany, World War II never would have happened. The argument Blaney makes, which is a pretty convincing one, is that we were a lot meaner in World War II when the West and the Soviets completely invaded and then parceled out the entirety of Germany. And there hasn't been a war in Germany since, as it turns out. Examples from the Middle East would include Israel's signal defeat of the Egyptian army in 1973. So Israel fully defeats the Egyptian army after they take their best shot in 1973, and the Egyptians decide at that point they do not have the ability to defeat the Israelis, and then they sign a peace agreement with the Israelis. So Jordan, same sort of thing, right? Jordan attacks in 1967. In 1967, Israel defeats them. The Jordanians never go to war with Israel again. I mean, so these are not just relevant examples, these are relevant examples from the region. Okay, so if you're talking about how do you achieve long-lasting peace in this particular region, I mean, first of all, Israel has achieved a pretty long-lasting cold peace with Egypt and with Jordan. They're achieving a much warmer peace with Bahrain, UAE, and they will with Saudi. I have full confidence. If you're talking about how do they achieve a long-lasting peace with, say, Lebanon, the answer is going to have to be such devastatingly effective military victory that there is likely a regime change that ends with some form of actual military governance in Lebanon sufficient to withhold power from Hezbollah, which, by the way, was supposed to be the case after 2005 when Israel 2006 when Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon. There's a UN resolution. I don't give a shit about the UN. The UN's a terrible place and it's filled with terrible people. But the UN resolution 1701 says that southern Lebanon was supposed to be completely demilitarized and UNIFIL was supposed to maintain control, and that never happened. So the only way to actually achieve long-lasting peace is by crushing the hopes and dreams of people who wish to attack their neighbors in such devastating fashion that they have no choice but to negotiate a peace. And so when it comes to Gaza, Israel has done that with Hamas. The only way Israel is going to be able to maintain that, unfortunately, Israel's desperately trying to find somebody to run the Gaza Strip. They offered it to Egypt. He was just like, are you kidding me? No way. They offered it to Saudi. Saudi doesn't want any piece of it. They offered it to Jordan. Jordan doesn't want any piece of it. No one wants a piece of the Gaza Strip, nor have they ever, by the way. Israel never wanted the Gaza Strip. In 1967, there was an open debate inside the Israeli cabinet whether they even had to go into the Gaza Strip, with most people arguing that if they could get away with not going in there and leaving it in Egyptian hands, they would do it. Okay, like the Gaza Strip has always been a trouble area. So Israel's going to have to probably militarily occupy the area and pacify it in a counterinsurgency operation for the foreseeable future until they're able to negotiate a broader peace in which somebody is willing to accept some responsibility there.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to speak with us and engaging with us. My question was about free speech. So I'm a leftist, and like.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. No, seriously,
Sure.
thanks for coming.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
And I agree. I agree that the left has a long ways to go in terms of addressing free speech and and their response to October 7th. But I think one of the things I struggle with is sort of like the sort of double standard the left is being held to, in that like the right claims that the left is the only ones infringing on free speech, right? I think just as it is like bad for the left to like strawman a vocal few conservatives and like label them all as white supremacists, it seems that it's just as bad to like label vocal few leftists as all Nazis, right? And the same way, it's like banning employment opportunities for leftists that express certain views, and saying that the same shouldn't happen to conservatives. So do you think that the right has a long way to go in terms of free speech as well, or do you think that this is purely a leftist problem?
I mean, I think that everyone can do better on free speech. I do think that it's disproportionate in terms of the attacks on free speech in the modern day and age. I think that if you would have gone back to 1965, there are probably more attacks on free speech from the right than the left. And if you go to today, there are more attacks on free speech from the left than the right. Also, I think some of the examples that you're using, the suggestion that like everybody on the left is censorious, I don't think that's true. I think that there are certain people who are. I think there are certain systems that are, for sure. But, again, it's easy to overstate.
Just quickly, like, for example, right, like, let's take the example of like high schools like censoring certain types of speech, or like the boycott of Bud Light, for example, right? Like, I mean, like in many ways, that's like similar to how the left cancels the right? It's like, isn't there like a pretty like big problem on the right?
So this is a really good question. So the reason this is such a good question is because I think that there's a category error that often gets made with regard to these sorts of questions. Well, what I mean by that is that it is in fact an element of free speech, and the left has said this too. It is an element of free speech for people to not want to go to my speech, for example. Or if people want to boycott the speech and not come, that's their prerogative. That is an element of free speech. If I choose not to buy Bud Light, that is also an element of free speech. That's how I choose to use my money. When it comes to cancel culture, I think that there's been a category error. There are two questions. One is whether people ever deserve to be boycotted, and the answer there is clearly yes, right? There are certain people who deserve to be boycotted, and then there's the question of who. And I think this is where you see the real imbalance. For the left in the United States, the Overton window within which you have to operate in order to not earn a boycott is extremely narrow. For the right, it's much wider, but I wouldn't say that it's completely gone. I believe in an Overton window. I do think, for example, that if I'm an employer, I do not have a moral obligation to hire people who believe that Hitler was a great guy. I don't have a moral obligation to do that, right? That's not me violating their free speech or boycotting them in a way that's a violation of free speech principles. Because I think the basic social contract suggests, again, they have a right to go and work in the United States, but they don't have a right to earn a job from me. I'm not calling for them to be jailed, and I think we also ought to differentiate between private action and public action in this particular venue, in this particular kind of area that we're talking about. With that said, the big imbalance that people are noting on the right is that the Overton window of the left is extremely narrow. You can say very mild things and get quote-unquote canceled if you are on the right, whereas if you're on the left, it's very, very difficult to say something so transgressive that the entire world turns on you and you lose your job. Like, you have to go a very long way in order to get there.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. I'm a huge fan of yours. As you can see, I'm Asian. I study artificial intelligence, so thank you for the call out. Yes.
Well, dude, congrats on getting in. Do they know you're Asian?
No. Yeah, I hit the box.
Okay.
You're the Deadpool of speeches and debates for me. Yes, really. So I'll get to serious business. So like three very short and questions, just like so. The first one: do you think William Shakespeare was an anti-Semite?
I mean, by the evidence in Merchant of Venice, sure. I mean, yes. I mean, The Merchant of Venice is, in fact, an anti-Semitic work. Does that mean it's not a great work? No. And I have a habit of trying to read great works and then also understand that there's terrible things often in great works. That's something new. I don't like bowdlerized versions of literature. I mean, by the way, that's true of an enormous number of people historically. A lot of people, I mean, a lot of great literature, a lot of great thinkers who weren't fond of my kind.
Okay. And the second one: do you think the tale of Robin Hood promotes socialism?
No, I think the tale of Robin Hood is a fight against overtaxation.
Okay.
The Sheriff of Nottingham.
So one last one. Just the last one. I don't want to take up too much time. So like, so I don't know if you've heard of an anime franchise called Sailor Moon. Do you think it promotes homosexuality and transgenderism?
Okay, I have heard of Sailor Moon. I do not know what it is. And are you asking me a question about anime? Is that a thing that's happening in real life right now?
So like I used to watch it, and like it just seems, I'm just starting to realize they seem to like promote lesbianism and transgenderism in certain of its seasons.
I have no specific views on whether Sailor Moon promotes transgenderism. I have to say I do not have any specific views on it.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for coming. I'm Caroline. My question is, do you think Israel is in a race against time, in a race to secure its geostrategic position before the U.S. becomes beholden to the left and its anti-Israel bias?
Yes. So I mean, the question is to whether Israel has got a short time frame in order to ensure its own security for the future as the left gains in power. The answer is obviously yes. I mean, you've seen the slow walking of the aid from the Biden administration, despite congressional approval of that same aid. And then you would see something very similar from the Harris administration, God forbid. I do think that you are seeing a growing sentiment, not only on the left that's like full-on anti-Israel, but there's a growing isolationist sentiment on the right that basically is doing a Fortress America routine, which I think is counterproductive, but it is growing. I think, by the way, the Israelis know that, and that's why I think they're reshoring a lot of their defense production. I think they'll be doing more of that in the near future. That, by the way, is actually a problem for the United States. If you believe the United States ought to have strong connections with its allies, and by the way, leverage over our allies, then you actually want there to be strong military aid connections with a wide variety of allies of the United States. Because it turns out that, let's say Israel does not get its arms from America, and let's say America wants to hold the leash on Israel. What leash? Right, so that is something that the defense establishment has always believed. The defense establishment has always been very much in favor of or at least in the modern era, post-67, of certain amounts of aid to Israel, because enormous amounts of aid are not only spent, all that aid gets spent in the United States, and additional military spending in Israel has to be spent in the United States, but also because that gives the United States leverage over Israel's foreign policy decisions as well. So the answer is yes. Israel is going to have to go its own way more. It's going to have to get more independent, and believe you me, they know it.
Hey, Ben, thanks for coming out today. I'm someone who used to be a Democrat and actually became a Republican after being exposed to viewpoints such as yours, so thank you for what you do. And actually now, I'm running for state representative here in the state of Connecticut as a Republican, so
Nice.
Thank you so much. My question is, how do we appeal to younger people who may be on the fence that could be swayed by Republican values? They're not totally convinced by Democrats, but they might think that it's not cool to be a Republican. What values or issues should we focus on?
Well, I mean, listen, it's not cool to be a Republican. It isn't. I mean, but I think that values tend to be uncool. I've never thought that cool was a particularly important thing in life, as you might be able to tell. But with that said, I think that the left has moved so far left that there is a rebellion brewing. It turns out that most people want to succeed in life. Most people want to thrive. Most people, at least in the United States, wish to be lions. There's a matrix that I've been working on for a while, kind of in my own head, about, everybody sort of has their version of, there are two kinds of people, right? But here's one of those two kinds of people, oversimplifications. There's two kinds of people. There are lions and there are scavengers. There are people who actually want to go out and they want to achieve. They want to build community. They want to build family. They want to innovate. They want to be entrepreneurial. They want to work a job. They want to grab control of their own life and make the best of that life, provide for their family, be warriors on behalf of their civilization. I think that's still most Americans because America was built on that. And then there are scavengers. There are people who truly believe that everything is owed to them and that the system in which they live needs to be torn away at. And it's a bad system and it needs to be dissolved or at least needs to be wounded. And I think the left preys on that. I think the left preys on this anger against the system. But the reality is that there is no hope in that. There is no building in that. Once you tear away the only system that has ever provided prosperity and freedom to humankind, which is the sort of freedoms guaranteed by the US Constitution, once you do that, the property rights and the Judeo-Christian history of the West, once you tear that away, there is nothing left to build on. And so when you say to people, listen, I'm not here to give you a handout. I'm not here to structure your life for you. I'm not here to make decisions about every little area of how you ought to live. What I am here to do is tell you, get off your ass, work, and you'll succeed in America. Because it turns out that if you do work in America, you will succeed in America. I mean, the very simple three-part rule that offends a lot of people. Graduate high school, don't have a baby before you get married, get a job. You do these three things, you will not be permanently poor in the United States. That is just the reality. And when you say to people, listen, any obstacles to those things, I want to help you clear away. Any obstacles to that, whether you're talking about big business collusion or whether you're talking about the government, which I think is mostly the problem, when anything we can do to tear that away and move that away from you so you can succeed, that I think is an inspiring message to people and it gives them a hope for their own future.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Ben, thanks so much for being here tonight. You mentioned Ukraine briefly earlier. I just wanted to get your take on what the perspective from a foreign policy standpoint should be on the continuation of the war. I know you've been attacked by certain factions in the Republican Party, most notably Tucker Carlson, for your support for continued funding of Ukraine. I sort of want your take on what you think the end game is in Ukraine and what should be the approach from a U.S. foreign policy perspective to achieve that.
Sure. So my approach to Ukraine, contra what Tucker perceives my approach to be, is that the United States should continue to fund Ukraine sufficient to maintain its current borders and pressure Russia to the table. Right? Ukraine is not going to take back Crimea or the Donbass. Just realistically speaking, the chances that Ukraine is going to be able to do that are very low. They've been low since 2014. That's nothing new. I've been saying since probably August of 2022 that the best thing the United States could do would be to actually quickly ramp up the amount of military aid being provided to Ukraine in order to pressure Russia for an off-ramp. And then Zelensky's in a bad position. I mean, you feel for him as a leader. He's in a position where his people have been absolutely ransacked, where hundreds of thousands of them have been killed, and his people correctly, morally speaking, don't want to give up a shred of the land they believe that they lost in 2014 and beyond. And you get that, totally. So Zelensky is not in a position where he can say, okay, fine, I'll sign a deal where I give away Crimea or the Donbass or sign any of that away, despite the fact that those two parts of Ukraine tend to be significantly more pro-Russian than the rest of the country. So what the United States might have to do is basically cut a deal in lieu of Zelensky and cram it down on him. Right? I mean, that might be something that has to happen, where the United States goes to Russia, if Russia were willing to negotiate, and says to Russia, here's the deal. we will have a mutual aid guarantee with Ukraine. We will guarantee their security. You're not going to invade their borders anymore, but the lines get frozen where they are, essentially. And then, you might have to cudgel Ukraine on the other side. Again, there's a bit of a different story from the situation with, say, Israel and its enemies, because Israel is the overwhelming military force in the region, as opposed to Ukraine, which is fighting against apparently an insuperable supply of human flesh that Putin is just drafting out of everywhere. So, if that sounds like a wildly hawkish perspective, that's weird, because it's precisely the perspective that Donald Trump has taken on the same issue.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. So I want to continue with the questions about Ukraine, and genuinely don't know the answer to the question I'm about to ask you, so I'd be interested in what you think about it. So there's been several reasons given by pro-Palestinian activists, pro-Hamas activists for why they support Hamas. Hamas hates the West, but Russia also hates the West. Israeli operations have killed many innocent Palestinian civilians, but Russia uses conscripts and abductees from Nepal and India, which are poor countries, and many of them go and sign along with the Russian military, only to find themselves in the front lines. Ukraine is funded by US taxes. Much of Israel's military, or at least Israel's military, gets a lot of aid. Ukraine has been a state for less than half the time than Israel has been a state. And about 7 times as many people have died in Ukraine as in the entire Israel-Hamas or Israel-Gaza war. So my question to you is, and seriously, I do not know the answer to this, but what is stopping somebody who is pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian from realizing these direct parallels and also supporting Russia?
Because, again, looking for logic in these places I think is difficult. And I think that what it really comes down to is, what is the position that is most coalitionally convenient? So I don't think that most of the pro-Hamas people on campus care deeply about, let's put it this way, the radical Muslim fundamentalists who agree with Hamas don't particularly care about Russia or Ukraine. That's not their issue, it's not their bag, they don't care about it very much, and in fact they tend to be more pro-Russia than the opposite, because Russia is very supportive of many of the activities of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. The sort of left-wing, bizarre dichotomy between the pro-Hamas position and the pro-Russia and the pro-Zelensky, pro-Ukraine position, I think that dichotomy comes down basically, it's weird how politics works, it comes down basically to a lot of people on the left really, really hate Russia, not because they hate Russia because they think that Russia stole the election for Donald Trump in 2016. I mean, I'm serious about this. In 2012, it was Barack Obama who was on a stage with Dmitry Medvedev, literally telling him on a hot mic that he would make concessions to Vladimir Putin post-election if Russia would leave off. So, I mean, I know you guys are young, but back in the olden days in 2012, it was Mitt Romney on a stage arguing against Russia and Barack Obama arguing the 1980s called and wanted their foreign policy back. The only thing that switched was the bizarre left-wing perception that Russia had somehow made Donald Trump president, which of course is not true.
Thank you.
This will be the final question.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. My question is regarding the concept of indigeneity, often being used, or being indigenous to a particular land being used as claim, often by the left, for a people to have a legitimate reason to occupy a territory or a piece of land. Just this morning, I saw a post saying that today is actually not about, a post by a pro-Palestinian organization about how today is not actually about October 7th, 2023, but rather about the Nakba that happened in 1947. I'm thinking, okay, if we're going to go back to 1947, then why not go back to, the 7th century AD when it was conquered by Muslim conquest, or if we even go back further, like 2,000 years ago when they were banished from this region. And so I just wanted to hear your view on what you think the importance, or how important it is to even have indigeneity as a concept when discussing ownership or claim to a land. How should we understand it? Or if we do use it, how far back should we go?
So, I mean, as you say, I think indigeneity tends to be much more of a, there's sort of internal claims and there's external claims. So internal claims, this is our land, this is the land that unifies us. Those are common and those exist across the world and there's nothing new about that. As sort of an external justifying claim, indigeneity tends to be a very weak response. And it tends to be a response, by the way. It doesn't tend to be the initial claim. It's not, I ought to have this land because my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had this land. We tend to perceive that as a very weak claim. We ought to perceive that as a very weak claim. It tends to be only used in the context of a counter-historical claim, right? Somebody will say, well, I ought to have this land because my grandfather had this land. And somebody says, well, your grandfather, he got it from my great-grandfather, right? And so it's more of a counterclaim. The sort of historic game playing here elides the central issue. Okay, so when I'm trying to simplify the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there's a very easy way to do this. Okay, the very easy way to do this is, would the world look better if it looked more like Israel, or would it look better if it looked more like, say, the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, or the Gaza Strip under Hamas? Okay, that's a very, very simple question, and it's a very easy question to answer, and nobody wants to answer it. So instead, there's obfuscation. Instead, you get people who are saying things like, well, it's really about what happened in 1947, and it's really what happened, during the Ottoman Empire, and it's really what happened if you go all the way back to when this land was occupied by the Crusaders. I mean, you can do that all day long. You really can. And it doesn't actually prove anything or help anything particularly. I mean, again, if you want to go back originally, according to the Bible, it was Canaanite. And if you want to go back to, most of the archaeology in Israel dates to, about the 2nd century BC when it was Jewish. And so this is a particularly weak claim. And we all know it's a weak claim, by the way, because nobody at Yale is proposing to give up the beautiful university to the Native American tribes who originally possessed this land, obviously. That sort of claim is, I think, a misdirect. I think it's a red herring. And I think that the people who use it definitely know that it's a red herring in order to avoid the obvious, which is everyone in the world would prefer to, by the way, including Arabs. Israeli Arabs are perfectly happy living in Israel, and none of them want to leave and live in the Gaza Strip or in the areas of Judea and Samaria known as the West Bank. No, nobody wants that.
Thank you.
Well, I believe that...
And with that, please join me in thanking Ben for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.